Part 3 of Poppies now, looking at the final stanza. It's quite a short stanza, but plenty to say about it. Now we need to think about the links and one or two things that come out through the entire poem. On reaching the top of the hill, I traced the inscriptions on the war memorial, leaned against it like a wishbone. The dove pulled freely against the sky, an ornamental stitch. I listened, hoping to hear your playground voice catching on the wind. There's no getting away from the tragedy and the sadness of the final stanza there. The confirmation that the mother wants to reconnect with her child, the son who she sent off to war reluctantly, but wanting to give him his freedom, and he's not returned from that. She's walked out in a rush, remember, without the reinforcements, as she mentioned, of the coat and the hat and the scarf. So she's rushed out, desperate to be with him, perhaps in a panic on hearing that news maybe. And she's reached the top of the hill to go back to the war memorial. Notice how she traces the inscriptions. So the war memorials, you'll have seen them because they're in every town and village across the country, are like gravestones. They're mass memorials for those who've lost their lives in conflict, and they're stoned. They're stoned and chiselled away with the names of those lost. And she's felt the need to feel a connection with those names, which she now does. Of course, she feels the connection with those emotions, and so she traces with her finger over the names to feel that. That sense of grief that other mothers must have felt, just like she's doing now, each one of those names becoming more significant now that her son's has been added to that. And she leans against the stone like a wishbone. Loads we can say about this. This is obviously our key image for this part of the presentation as well. I wonder whether initially she's leaned against it in desperation, perhaps just almost half collapsing against it with the grief, to form that sort of shape. And that simile literally reflects the shape of a wishbone. If you've ever had like Sunday dinner chicken or something, you'll know that the wishbone comes up in two halves like an arc with a join at the top, and physically she's leaning against the war memorial like that to physically form that sort of arc type shape. And I wonder whether she's just collapsed in grief like that, or is it something slightly different? The wishbone is supposed to be where you grab with your little fingers and pull, and the winner makes their wish, and their wish is supposed to come true in that sort of myth. And I wonder whether she's leaning against the war memorial, forming that shape, because she doesn't want to break that shape. She doesn't want to relinquish that wish, that desperate hope that her child can come back. And that links to that, doesn't it? The wishbone. She could have used a simile like an arc, like an alleyway. She could have used so many different similes, but that wishbone is so crucial. It's her deepest wish, her deepest desire for her son not to be missing in action, not to be dead. And she doesn't want to break that shape to keep the wish. Also, we've got that sense of the cyclical structure of the poem. We started off at the War Memorial on 3 days before Armistice Day, where we're remembering the dead soldiers, and now she feeling a little bit distant from that initially because it was her son who was in the parade alive, now feels much more connected to that. She much more understands the sadness connected with the deaths, because she can empathise, she can personally feel that sense of loss, that sense of grief at the end. So we've come around from remembering others for her to remember her own loss in conflict. The dove pulled freely against the sky, an ornamental stitch. Last time in part 2 we were talking about the dove as a symbol of peace, a symbol of remembrance. So the dove again reminds her why she's leaning against the wishbone. But notice as well the ornamental stitch. An ornamental stitch is a sort of sewing thread that you would do as a sort of flourish to the final piece of clothing that you'd be making. And notice all the way through we've got this semantic field of textiles. And I wonder, firstly, it might be the sense of the mother clothing her child, maybe making clothes for her child, and so this idea of textiles comes through. We've talked about the juxtaposition between the military and the domestic, and certainly there's nothing more domesticated perhaps than making clothes for the children. Jane Weir, the poet, has an interest in textiles, coming from Manchester, where that was once the centre of the textile industry. So there's perhaps a number of different reasons. I like to think of the idea of the mother making clothes for the child, that sense of the materials being tactile, being able to be felt, is really important. And we had that image of felt earlier on in the poem, turn to felt, and there's a little pun there, isn't it, on the felt of a textile, but also the past tense of to feel. So the idea of feelings and textiles are linked really, really closely in this poem. So she looks at that dove pulling an ornamental stitch across the sky. It reminds her of her child. It reminds her of his clothing, both his military clothing and perhaps the clothing that he wore as a child, and she longs once again to take the cat hairs off with sellotape, to pat down his lapel, to straighten his collar, to do all of those things that she was describing back in the first stanza. I listened, hoping to hear your playground voice catching on the wind. What a tragic image that is. The idea of a mother desperately holding on to hear her son as a child once again, and listening on the wind. Many parents will have gone through the times where they've listened for their child coming out of school of a night on collection. And again, there's nothing more nurturing, nothing more natural as a parent to pick your child up from school, to listen for their voices playing out. And she longs for that time once again. She longs for that connection back with her child, back with her son. And it's desperately sad, isn't it, perhaps, because there might be images there that she feels that she shouldn't have let him go free. And all she wanted to do with that idea of the world overflowing like a treasure chest, all she wanted to do was to give him that chance, that freedom, that independence. And now that freedom and independence has only led to his death. So perhaps to go back right to his childhood and listen to the playground voice is the sense of her wanting to nurture her child again, wanting to care for her child, wanting perhaps to change the course of the child's ambitions and to go back in time and wish it had all been different perhaps. But this is not a protest poem, we must remember. This is not Jane Weir as a poet protesting against war. The mother in the poem is not protesting against war. There's just that sense of sadness. There's not bitterness there. And it's all about wishing and hoping and remembering. There's not anger in there. And all, as sad as that last image is, that last idea of hoping to hear your playground voice catching on the wind, it doesn't have bitterness in there. It's very much about remembering. Okay, so the poem is an individual's reflection on loss during conflict. It links really well with a number of different poems. Let's think about Kamikaze first of all, and the idea of regret comes through this poem, which might be linked to that tone within Kamikaze, and also that personal connection between the narrator in Kamikaze and the mother here, wishing that things have been different, but obviously in very, very different circumstances, whereas the grandfather in Kamikaze had chosen to live. The son in this poem has been taken away before his time, and you've got a sense of time passing by really quickly in this poem, which will contrast nicely with Kamikaze, where time passes by much more slowly. There are echoes in War Photographer of personal reflections on war, as there are in Remains as well. You could link it to Bayonet Charge, the idea of youth becoming a weapon. And the gelled blackthorns in this poem is a similar image to Numb as a Smashed Arm in many ways. The idea of the men becoming soldiers, becoming weapons. So there's some sense of link there. But in actual fact, Poppies would go with any of the war poems, really, even ones like Charge of the Light Brigade, where you could contrast greatly between the idea of glorifying war and here just the more sad, reflective tone than the idea of honour and jingoism in Charge of the Light Brigade. But there are some shared imagery. There's some similar tones in here. She's very proud of her son, just as we are implored by Tennyson to be proud and to honour the Light Brigade. So loads of poems that this would go to nicely. So another poem that unlocks a lot of connections as well.